Hey everyone, this is Pete. Welcome back to Atari A to Z Flashback, a series of explorations of the 150 games that make up Atari Flashback Classics for Nintendo Switch. Today's game is International Soccer. This was a 1980 release on Mattel's M Network label, which you may recall if you've seen earlier episodes of this series, was Mattel's way of releasing versions of Intellivision games from their own platform on Atari 2600. In this case, it's a port of NASL Soccer, which is a game based on the short-lived North American Soccer League that ran between 1968 and 1984. Contemporary reviewers really liked this game. They sort of praised its unique perspective and scrolling screen and implementation of the rules. And like a lot of sports games from this era, there's actually some fun to be had for people who don't particularly like football, soccer, like me, because it makes a lot of simplifications to the rules to make it a better video game. And yeah, the only sort of downside to this is that it's 2-player only. So I'm probably going to have to rely on Future Pete and Future Pete's wife, who is also my wife, as you will recall, to demonstrate some gameplay for us. So let's go play International Soccer. Okay, here we are once again with Atari Flashback Classics. And today we're taking a look at International Soccer. Now this is a 2-player only game, so I'll be recruiting Future Pete and my wife in just a moment to demonstrate the game to us. But before we do that, let's just have a quick look at the manual. The object of the game is to score more goals than your opponent in 2 simulated 45-minute periods. A goal is scored by kicking the ball into your opponent's net. You know, to play soccer, hopefully. Football, as we call it over here. Each player has a 4-man team. You control 1 man on your team. The computer controls the other 3 and moves them to simulate a full 11-man team. You see a third of the soccer field at any given time during gameplay. The screen moves, or scrolls, to follow gameplay. Now, that latter aspect there, I suspect, is one of the main reasons that this game exists, because it's mentioned numerous times throughout the manual. So they're clearly very proud of their scrolling system. So here we are. Just gives you an outline of how to play football, how to play the game. It's all fairly self-explanatory. The way that the whole team is implemented in this is, as it said before, you control 1 person at a time. If you're on defence, the computer will pick the person for you, and if you've got the ball, you control the person who's got the ball. And a bit like in some other football games of the period, there's a system whereby if you run off the top or bottom of the screen, the person you're controlling will reappear on the other side of it. And so in that way, it only has to display 4 sprites on screen at once. But it sort of simulates having a much larger team in that way. And you'll see how that works when we come to play. You'll also notice at the top there, no offsides, goalies, throw-in, corner kicks, goal kicks, penalties, timeouts, or overtime, because those are all too complicated to program on the 2600. This is an M Network game, so I'm not sure if the Intellivision version had any of those things, but they're certainly not in this one. It's a very simple, straightforward football game. Now here we are. As the ball moves downfield, the screen will move, or scroll, in the opposite direction, so the ball is never off screen. The screen will stop scrolling when either goal comes fully in view. If a man goes off the top or bottom of the screen during scrolling, he will reappear at the other end of the screen in the same relative place. This feature is useful for passing and goal defence. Yeah, this is an amusing one here. Your controlled man may be too far from your goal to reach it in time to defend it. Move him in the opposite direction until he disappears off the end of the screen opposite your goal. He will reappear at the goal. So yes, there's some entertaining sort of teleporting around the pitch that you can do in this, thanks to that little mechanic there. This isn't the greatest football game I've ever played or anything like that, but it is an Atari 2600 football game. As I say, Future Pete and my wife are going to demonstrate it for you now. It says it's got shortened 45-minute periods, but it still took a good 20 minutes to do just half of a game. So we're only going to show you the first half of our match, because we were both a bit tired of the whole experience by the end of that. But you'll get an idea of how this all plays. And there's no sort of different game selects or difficulty settings or anything in this. So it's literally everything there is to show in this. So, all right, I will hand over now to Future Pete and my wife, and they will tell you all about. Well, Pete will tell you all about, and my wife will help demonstrate what International Soccer for the Atari 2600 is all about. We'll see you in a moment. Okay, Future Pete here with International Soccer. My wife and I preparing to kick off. I am the yellow team and my wife is the blue team. And as we commence, you'll notice the clock at the top of the screen counting down in slightly accelerated time, but it still takes a good 20 minutes or so to play a half, so I hope you're ready for a thrilling soccer match right here. With, yeah, there you go. So, an immediate goal from me there. And we can see the scrolling in action as we play and admire the beautiful sounds of the Atari 2600 farting out a vague approximation of someone kicking a ball. And there we go. So, you should be able to already see some of the ways that this game simplifies the rules of soccer in order to, well, either fit within the constraints of the Atari 2600, which is more likely, or to make it an accessible game. As we've talked about a few previous times when we've looked at other sports games in Atari Flashback Classics, a lot of these are actually more accessible to people who aren't super familiar with the sports in question because they're so simplified, because they're a very straightforward take on the sports in question that don't require an in-depth knowledge of the rules or sort of more obscure things to do with sort of, I don't know, penalties and fouls and that sort of thing along the way. Like in this, there's no throw-ins or corner kicks or goal kicks or anything like that. The ball just bounces off the edge of the arena. So I guess you could argue it's more like playing indoor soccer or something like that, except you've got, well, you've got a simulation of a larger team. You've still only got 4 people on screen at once, and you've got no goalkeepers, which is fun. But yeah, the mechanics of this are pretty simple. So you control the player on your team that is represented as the forward-facing sprite, and the characters that are running sideways in true Intellivision man tradition are computer-controlled, and those are... I don't know if I want to say they've got artificial intelligence about them. Sometimes they seem to run in the direction of the ball, and sometimes they seem to be a complete liability. So it's kind of hard to say how effective they are. One thing you do need to figure out quite quickly in this game is how the wraparound system works, because it's not only useful for controlling your own player and disappearing off one side of the screen and reappearing on the other, but it also allows you to pass to players who are off screen. So this actually took my wife and I a bit of time to figure out while we were playing. It was only in the sort of last couple of minutes of the game that we noticed that was really the case. So up until that point, we felt like it was a bit of a crapshoot when you passed the ball down the field, because it sort of felt like you were just sort of having to hope that there was going to be a player there waiting for it. No, but you can actually tell if there's going to be a player there waiting for it, because when one of your computer control players disappears off the top or bottom of the screen, thanks to the scrolling, they reappear in the same horizontal position when they come back on the other side of the screen. So actually you can predict where the players are going to be, and so you can pass into what appears to be an empty space, scroll the screen up or down, so that one of your players goes off one edge of the screen, and then magically there'll be a player there waiting for the ball to reach them. And once you figure that out, you can actually be surprisingly tactical with this game. And it kind of eliminates the need of a lot of modern soccer games to sort of tap a button to pick which player you're controlling and so on, because you can use the position of the computer control players on the field to make those tactical decisions. Would it have been nice to have the option for full control, perhaps? Maybe as a different game mode or something like that. A different game mode that would allow the defensive player to press the button to switch between the different players on their team, perhaps would have worked quite nicely. But as it is, this is the way that they've implemented it in this game. And for the most part, it seems to work quite well. And passing is a case of just kicking the ball to another player on your team, and when the ball arrives at their feet, you will take over control of that player. You can see by them changing shape. And tackling the ball is just a case of walking the character that you're controlling into the ball at the feet of your opponent. And then when you get to the goal, all you have to do is you have to actually kick it over the line yourself. You can't just walk it in, which is a terrible shame for those who enjoy doing such things. But no, you do actually have to tap it across the line, even if you're right up against the edge. And you'll notice that the fact that this game doesn't really incorporate a comprehensive set of football rules means that you get a lot more in the way of sort of big bundles of people in the goal area and players effectively walking the ball into the goal in this one. So there is a bit of a weakness in the computer control players in that they just sort of walk back and forth in front of the goal and often will just sort of wander off in their own direction. So that can make defending your goal quite difficult sometimes, particularly when they're wandering in a predictable pattern. And that means that your opponent can just walk around them and just tap the ball into the goal without too much difficulty. And you'll see that happen a few times in this game. Like I think here might be... Oh no. Yes, there's a great example. So like... My wife's player who was protecting the goal there actually just stopped moving completely there, so there was nothing she could do to prevent me scoring there. Which can be a little bit frustrating. So I mean, I didn't have a terrible time playing this, but I could tell my wife is getting a bit annoyed by the end of it, particularly with how long the game goes on for. It's quite unusual for an Atari 2600 game to last this long. I think we've talked previously about the how many games made use of the 2 minutes and 16 seconds time frame, because that was regarded to be a fairly optimal amount of time for people to have fun without getting bored. And also, when it came to arcade games, that was a good amount of time to leave people feeling like they had a satisfying experience, but still encouraging a decent turnover of players or people willing to put more money into the machine. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a balancing act there, though, because the kind of people who... Certainly the kind of people who play sports games these days tend to be people who have an active interest in the sport. I'm not sure how true that was back in the early days of video gaming, because, I mean, sports games were just another type of video game at that point rather than something specifically designed for enthusiasts. But certainly if you're aiming a game specifically at sports fans, a lot of them would probably prefer a more realistic experience, which includes games going on for a bit longer rather than a very short, brief arcade-style experience. And I guess that may have been where the thinking behind the fairly long time limit in this game came from. Because it certainly allows for a very long game, but at the same time, the very nature of the way the game's constructed, with the 4 characters on screen at once and that sort of thing, it means that you end up scoring a lot more goals in that amount of time than you would in a real football match. Right, here we're at 13-4 already, and we're not even halfway through the first half. So I don't know, like I say, it's a balancing act, and as we've mentioned numerous times before, in the early days of video games, a lot of developers were still trying to figure out the best way of doing a lot of things, trying to figure out the best way to simulate sports, the best way to make an entertaining video game out of various concepts, what concepts did and didn't work as a video game, full stop. And I think this game is probably an example of a developer experimenting with the idea of incorporating some more realistic aspects to the experience, most notably the time limit, and seeing if it worked. Now, offhand, I'm not 100% sure how well received this game was back in the day. In fact, while we continue to watch this, I'm actually just going to look it up online and see if there's any information about how well received it was. So, International Soccer, Atari 2600. Let's have a look on Atari Mania, because this is often a good place to do it. No, there's just catalogues here. Is there a Wikipedia article for it? Oh, right. It might be worth looking up the NASL Soccer title for Intellivision, because that's what this was a port of. So the Intellivision version was quite well received, because the reviewers found the perspective to work quite well and the scrolling playfield to be, quote, fascinating even to those who don't care for the real sport. So, and I mean, I can see that, because I am very much not a big fan of sports in general, but football in particular. Just because when I was... It's kind of a long-term thing, really. It's because when growing up, being into football was seen as sort of the default thing that boys in particular should be doing. And I kind of resented that, because I didn't enjoy the sport. I didn't enjoy playing the sport in PE classes at school. I didn't particularly like the culture that surrounded football, and my family as a whole was fairly... I don't know if I want to say anti-football, because that sounds like they were sort of a lot more active in disliking the sport than they really were. But no one in our family was into sport, really. And so I just sort of grew up not really having much fondness for football in general. And I've never really felt the need to pursue that. As I grew up and through my teenage years and into my adulthood, I just never felt the need to explore that further. And so I'm coming to this game specifically as someone who doesn't care for the sport. And I agree that there's some appeal here for people who don't enjoy the real sport, because it's a fun video game. And I talked about this back when we looked at the really janky old Atari American football game and Home Run and various other games like this. A lot of these early sports games are just fun video games, especially if they have a single player mode, which this one unfortunately doesn't. But especially if they have a single player mode, they're just quite fun to play, and you don't need to understand the sport, because in a lot of cases rules and stuff were deliberately left out of the game to make it play a bit better as a video game, or perhaps to work within the constraints of the technology of the time. So I suspect a lot of the rules in this were left out just to keep things fairly straightforward and simple for the poor old 2600. But at the same time, I kind of like that aspect of them. You may recall a long time ago in this series when we looked at the arcade game Pool Shark. The designer described it as something that was almost entirely unlike pool. But it was still a fun game. It was still a fun video game. It was something that was enjoyable to play. It had some interesting mechanics. The fact that didn't follow the rules of pool actually made it more interesting, because it was something you had to kind of figure out the best approach for yourself. And it's kind of similar here, because it's one of those games where you're working within a framework of very simple mechanics. You've got movement controls and you've got a kick button. But by also incorporating things like the computer controlled players and the fact that it bounces off the boundaries of the pitch and that sort of thing, you can put together a surprisingly varied tactical experience for this. I mean, you've hopefully noticed over the course that we're playing this that although I've scored 21 goals at this point, each of those goals has happened in a slightly different way. It's not just a case of you find a single tactic and it just continues to work. Because you've got the inherent variation of playing against another player, for one thing. Because there's always a somewhat unpredictable aspect there. But also you've got the flexibility of those basic mechanics. Because those basic mechanics are so simple, but there's so many different ways you can apply them in this game by making use of different combinations of them. It actually makes for a surprisingly interesting and varied experience. But as I said, I feel like the one weakness of this game is just the sheer amount of time it takes to play a game. And I think this game would have definitely benefited from, if not necessarily a mandatory shorter game, then certainly making use of the game select switch to have different lengths of time that you play for. If I remember correctly, Real Sports Soccer, which we'll be looking at in a while, I believe that has different lengths of game that you can do. And it definitely has different speeds and stuff as well, and different mechanics that you can turn on and off as well. So I guess you can look at that as a sort of refinement of this for me, because I think the Real Sports series was a little bit later than this came out. But it's clear that everyone developing these games was learning and borrowing ideas from one another and figuring out the best way to do things. And yeah, some things work, some things don't. And as I say, if you're a particular football enthusiast, you might appreciate the fact that this allows for a fairly long, quite high-scoring game. And it would be interesting to see what two players of equal skill would make of this game. I'm not saying that I'm sort of absolutely the best Atari 2600 football game player in my life, but I mean, I am beating my wife 25-6 here. At least part of that in these last few minutes was that my wife had pretty much given up by this point because she was getting bored. So, I don't know. If you're going to play this, you need someone who's going to be invested with it for the whole period. But here we are. We're coming towards the end of the experience now. So, I better prepare to sign off as we go into the last minute of the match. And my wife refuses to play the second half of the match. And I'll say, as always, thank you very much for watching. And I'll see you again next time.